Today is the day that you were supposed to be baptized, but you've had to postpone again because of a promise your mother made to your father. When your pastor asks if you're ready, you say no with your mother, but your sister, she says that she's ready. And it is in that moment that you see her courage and her fearlessness, and you ask yourself, what am I waiting for? What more does God need to do to get my attention? That is what my good friend Soko Bongo asked herself, and she awoke from her spiritual slumber, and a newness of identity was given to her. Soko was raised in a religiously split household. Her father was Methodist and her mother Mormon. It is expected of you to follow the religion of your father in the Tongan culture, so she was raised Methodist. 7 years ago, half of her family decided to change religions from her father, which led to a major conflict for some time. I remember walking to my aunt's house and seeing Soko piled into the living room with all of her siblings. I remember sitting and talking with her and seeing how tired and stressed she was. She had so much pressure on her shoulders that an 18-year-old shouldn't have to deal with. I had no idea that her father kicked them out of the house because they changed religions. But even with all this conflict in her home, she was still able to develop her identity by accepting these challenges in her life. This is why I wanted to tell you her story. I studied the effects of two religions in one home because I wanted to help others understand how people develop their identities in an interfaith home. Why should we as Christians care about this issue? Ephesians 6:2 says, honor your father and mother. But how are you expected to honor them if they have two different beliefs? This may seem minor, but it is a real issue. Children are put in the middle of their parents' feud and stuck with having to choose between them. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership can righteousness have with wickedness? Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? Children of interfaith families are at risk of struggling to find their identities because they are being unequally yoked with the conflicting religions. When there is more than religion in the home, more than one religion in a home, the discussion of religion decreases, leading to the increase of non-believers. 2 Corinthians 7:12-13 says, so even though I wrote to you, it is not on the account of the one who did wrong or the one who was harmed, but rather that your earnestness on our behalf would be made clear to you in the sight of God. On account of this, we are encouraged. In addition to our own encouragement, we are even more delighted by the joy of Titus, for his spirit has been refreshed by all of you. The children raised in interfaith families need to be encouraged by us Christians to help them find their identity. Being raised in an interfaith home is a battle within, but it doesn't have to be if we Christians are there to help them. For my literature review, there are 3 themes that we are going to discuss: the increase of the interfaith demographic, the parental conflict between interfaith couples, and the adolescent stage, which is when a child develops their religious identity. According to Lorraine Elise Sosa, there are more than 375,000 interfaith couples in the United States, and the numbers continue to increase every year. Travis Mitchell from the Pew Research Center says that 1 in 5 U.S. adults are raised in a mixed religious background. Mitchell also mentions that people raised in religiously mixed households are considerably less likely to say religion was a salient feature in their childhood. Christina Lizhardy-Hashby states in her article how churches are starting to respond to the interfaith family dynamic. In the past 10 years, religious communities' involvement in the interfaith worship has doubled, and the involvement of interfaith community services activities has nearly tripled. She also discusses that with the increase of interfaith families, people of faith are starting to find new ways to support the spiritual formation of this particular group. Now, the conflict between the interfaith couples. According to Parsons and other colleagues, when a couple decides to marry, both individuals begin the process of negotiating or renegotiating numerous issues that may arise, such as child rearing, careers, place of residence, holidays, religious denominations. Parsons also mentions that this process is not easy, and at times it can lead to tension, conflict, and even marriage dissatisfaction. Sousa mentions how this conflict affects not only the couple, but the children in the home. Now, the adolescent stage. Parsons and other colleagues discusses how the important stage in a religious development occurs during the adolescence, which is the ages 11 and 18, and is labeled as identity versus identity diffusion. This stage is where the adolescent starts to create their own morals, code of ethics, political perspectives, and religious viewpoints that are separate from the parents. If this stage is not adequately resolved, then the child may experience some confusion of what their place in society or even the world is. Sosa says that the children of adolescents of the interfaith couples say that parents should provide an environment in which children would feel comfortable living with their religious identity. She also goes on to say that the parents of an interfaith family have to remember that this is a confusing time in their child's life as they attempt to differentiate from family and develop their own identity. If parents are flexible in their family boundaries, then this will allow the child to explore and establish a sense of their own self apart from the family. When I first started my ethnography, I began with my research. I used the library database, but I struggled to find articles because it's such a sensitive topic. But then, after using words such as interfaith families, mixed faith families, all the articles that I needed showed up. I was able to interview a few siblings that were raised in a single interfaith home, and they all had different perspectives on their faith. They were the perfect example of how the conflicts in an interfaith home could affect how one forms their identity. I had to ask myself, how is it these siblings were all raised under the same roof, but they all have different beliefs? It was interesting getting a chance to talk to them because they had different answers to my questions. I chose to communicate with them via email because I wanted them to be comfortable with answering the sensitive questions, like how in an article that I read, Issues Interviewing Interfaith Families, written by Nesbitt and Arwick. I was also able to interview my friend Soko Bongo over FaceTime, and we had a very deep conversation. Since we were close to the siblings, when I interviewed her, I could tell that she was answering me honestly. I'm very happy to have spoken with Soko because she has so much insight on how she developed her identity. The first thing I noticed in my research was that the siblings that were not comfortable with answering my questions kept their answers short. And they also mentioned that there was no conflict in their home related to religion, and they believed that the two religions in their home were similar to one another. But the siblings that were comfortable answering my questions said that there was conflict in the home related to the religion, and they even had stories to share with me. One sibling, for example, Esateli Hafoka, gave me 2 highlights that she can remember in her life. The first was when she was 8 years old. Her mother wanted her to be baptized Mormon, because that's the age that you are when you're baptized. But she declined because she knew that her father abhorred the Mormon religion and she didn't want to upset him. Her mom wasn't too mad, and she told her that she could make the decision when she was older. The second highlight was when she was around 24 years old when she decided to be baptized Seventh-day Adventist, like her father. Her mother was so upset that she told her that the only reason that she was being baptized was because her friends were doing so, and that she was brainwashed. Before she could even leave the home, her mother took a drawer from the dresser and threw it at her. My most emotional interview was with Soko. Her eyes watered when she described how she no longer wanted a superficial relationship with God, and that she wanted a deeper and more intimate relationship with Him after witnessing her sister's courage. My journey as an ethnographer was not an easy one. I had no idea where to begin with my research. The first person that came to mind when discussing this topic was my aunt, who is a religious studies scholar. She is the one that introduced me to the siblings that I interviewed, and she gave me their numbers. Then I remembered Soko. I talked to her first because I knew that she would open up to me. After we talked for hours about my ethnography, a veil was lifted from my eyes. She helped me realize that the religious differences in her home helped her build the strength in her religious identity. I'm grateful for my dear friend because she gave me the confidence that I needed to reach out to the others. When I first began my research, I assumed that everyone raised in an interfaith home wished to be raised in a single faith home. But that wasn't the case. And the research that I found and the people that I talked to showed me that being unequally yoked does have an effect on how one forms their identity. But there are the few that can take the conflict in their homes and build a strong faith in God. The only regret that everyone had was the conflict that they experienced when growing up. Adolescence is a very important stage in one's life when finding their identity. So the parents in the home have to work towards being peaceful in order to help their children. This is important for Christians to pay attention to, because if there's no peace in the home, then the children will struggle to find their ultimate unity and eventually become non-believers. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, "As a fair exchange, I ask you, my children, open wide your hearts also." We have to fellowship with those few who have not found their identity or spiritual connection to Christ. The conflict in the home of interfaith families can turn into a strength for the children if we Christians are able to help them along their spiritual journey